In our last lecture, we tried to place the earliest English novels in a wider historical context. We talked about the emergence of capitalism in 18th century England. We talked about the explosion of the urban population in 18th and 19th century England, and we used Samuel Richardson's Pamela as a way of investigating some of the class tensions and class conflicts that seem to have been characteristic of that period. In this lecture, we're going to need to refine our thinking about the relationship between history and literature by attending to several complications. And the first of those complications is the fact that the historical situation in the middle of the 18th century prompted not a single response, but actually a wide variety of responses. And that sort of variety is certainly evident in the striking contrasts between Samuel Richardson, who was born in 1689 and dies in 1761, and Henry Fielding, born 1707, dies 1754, two of the first great masters of the novel form. As I suggested last time, comparisons between Richardson and Fielding are commonplace. Indeed, those comparisons are almost inevitable, since both of them produced their major works in the 1740s, and since both of them imagined and presented themselves as rivals. Richardson is the author not only of Pamela from 1740, but also of Clarissa, which appeared from 1747 to 1749, an even more ambitious and controversial work. Clarissa may be the longest novel in the English language. A recent paperback edition is 1,500 pages long. Very, very small type, too. Unlike Pamela, Clarissa does not have a happy ending. We have the same basic situation in Clarissa. We have a man pursuing a woman who wants to maintain her virtue. But in this case, that man succeeds in raping the heroine, and she dies, more or less as a consequence of that act. This makes Clarissa one of a handful, and I mean a handful, of English novels from the 18th and 19th century with a kind of tragic shape. In previous lectures, we've noted the importance of comedic endings and comedic attitudes to English fiction. Clarissa is the great counterexample in the 18th century, at least. So that gives us some sense of who Richardson is. Fielding is the author of two great novels. Joseph Andrews from 1742, which is a kind of unauthorized sequel to Pamela. Joseph Andrews is supposed to be Pamela's brother. Her name is Pamela Andrews. And Tom Jones from 1749, which is universally regarded as Fielding's masterpiece. Fielding's great novel begins with the discovery of an infant boy, later named Tom Jones, in the bed of a country gentleman. The aim of this story is twofold. First, we need to discover the truth of Tom's origins. Who are his parents? Where does he fit into society? Who really is he? Orphans turn up over and over again in English fiction. You probably recall a number of examples from Dickens. And one reason for their popularity is the fact that they are so mysterious. Not just for personal reasons, but for social reasons as well. We can't quite figure out where to place them in the social hierarchy. So that's the first of the major aims of this story. The second major aim of Tom Jones is to trace Tom's moral development, the changes that take place in his character and in his behavior over the course of this story. At the beginning of the story, Tom is very good-natured. Everyone likes Tom. Almost everyone loves Tom, as a matter of fact, but he lacks prudence. He's a little reckless. He often does things without thinking them through. He enjoys drinking, maybe a bit too much. He enjoys, the ladies, maybe a bit too much, and he gets into trouble as a consequence of these faults. As Tom journeys through the English countryside and into London, he succumbs to many temptations. But by the end, Tom has realized his mistakes and won the heart of the beautiful and virtuous Sophie Western. He has also been identified as the nephew of the gentleman in whose bed he was first discovered. So at the end of the story, all of the mysteries are resolved. We know exactly who he is, and we know why he deserves to be rewarded so handsomely. Richardson and Fielding are in many ways polar opposites, and here we'll attempt a kind of biographical sketch of each author. Starting with Richardson, who is the perfect representative of the rising middle class. The son of a cabinet maker, we think he has little formal education. We don't know for sure, but that's what we think. We know for sure that he is apprenticed to a printer at the age of 17. By his early 30s, Richardson is running his own very successful printing business, and by his late 40s, he is publishing his own writings and assembling his own literary salon. So he's nothing if not upwardly mobile. And when Pamela becomes a commercial success, he also becomes the target of considerable abuse. According to his critics, chief among them being Fielding, Richardson is graceless, priggish, and ultimately hypocritical. His heroine may insist on preserving her virtue, but her real aim is wealth and social advancement. In striking contrast with Richardson, Fielding appears almost aristocratic. He's confident of his literary abilities and social skills, and he certainly had reason to be confident. His family connections were excellent, and he enjoyed the benefit of a splendid classical education at Eton. His writings are filled with classical allusions and are designed to give the impression that he is a gentleman. To give you a sense of his typical self-presentation, I'd like to examine a passage from Tom Jones in which the narrator lists the essential qualities of a good writer or historian. On the narrator's list, in addition to talent and worldly experience, is learning. Here's the passage. Invention and judgment are not sufficient for our purpose without a good share of learning. Now, let's stop there and just consider the way that he introduces this argument, the way that he sets up this idea. He starts by talking about invention and judgment. What does he have in mind there? Well, by invention, he simply means creativity, the ability to imagine interesting situations, to imagine interesting characters. Judgment, that's got more to do, I think, with general intelligence, an ability to see what might happen if the reader were to encounter such a situation or to encounter such a character. Invention and judgment. Now, he goes on to say that these two things, though very important, though necessary to the great writer, are not sufficient, that it also takes a good share of learning. And about that phrase, we might also ask some questions. What kind of learning does he have in mind? What kind of learning counts in the middle of the 18th century? Well, we have to, in answering that question, set aside our own notions of liberal education, because he's not here talking about science. He's not here talking about social science, economics, political science. He's not talking about anything of the kind, really. He's talking here about classical literature and the history of ancient Greece and Rome. This is what he mostly has in mind. You can't be a great writer. This is what he's saying. No matter how inventive you are, no matter how creative you are, if you don't know how the Greeks and Romans did it, if you're not familiar with the precedents established for writers by Homer, by Virgil, by all of the other great classical writers. So with that in mind, let's move through the rest of the passage. I'll back up and start again so that we can see exactly where he's going. Invention and judgment are not sufficient for our purpose without a good share of learning, for which I could again cite the authority of Horace and of many others, if any was necessary, to prove that tools are of no service to a workman when they are not sharpened by art, or when he wants rules to direct him in his work, or hath no matter to work upon. Now there are a couple of interesting things to point out here. First, in substantiating his claim that classical learning is very important, he turns to a classical writer. He turns to Horace. And in so doing suggests that he's not inventing anything new in this passage. He's simply repeating, restating, albeit in a different way, the sort of received wisdom that's been passed down to him from the ancient writers. So that's the first interesting thing to see. The second interesting thing to see is that his image of the writer is actually a kind of homely and common one. The workman, the man who builds a house, that's the person to whom the writer, the author, the creative genius is being compared here. So there's a way in which creativity is being acknowledged in this passage, and there's a way, too, in which diligence is being acknowledged in this passage. Skill, craft, all of the things that you pick up from studying the work of earlier sort of practitioners in your field. Let's back up again. I could again cite the authority of Horace and of many others, if it was necessary, to prove that tools are of no service to a workman when they are not sharpened by art, or when he wants rules to direct him in his work, or hath no matter to work upon. All these uses are supplied by learning, for nature can only furnish us with capacity, or, as I have chose to illustrate it, with the tools of our profession. Learning must fit them for use, must direct them in it, and lastly must contribute at least part of the materials. A competent knowledge of history and of the belles lettres is here absolutely necessary, and without this share of knowledge at least, to affect the character of an historian is as vain as to endeavor at building a house without timber or mortar or brick or stone. Homer and Milton, who, though they added the ornament of numbers to their works, and by that he simply means that they wrote in verse, were both historians of our order, were masters of all the learning of their times. Now this passage might be read as yet another shot at upstart writers like Richardson, who don't really know enough to assume the responsibility of authorship. Certainly by comparison with Richardson, whose work he often parodies, Fielding seems at ease with himself, comfortable with people from almost every walk of life. Now, given the differences in their life stories, it's no surprise to find that the works of these writers are strikingly different. Whereas Richardson is invariably serious and solemn, Fielding is witty, ironic, and sometimes bawdy. Richardson occasionally pokes fun at his heroines, occasionally pokes fun at Pamela in particular, but he usually treats her predicament very, very seriously, suggesting that her life depends on the preservation of her virtue. Now, although Fielding does not approve of Tom's indiscretions, which, as I've noted, include drinking and brawling and spending time with the ladies, he refuses to judge his hero too harshly. He does not believe that Tom's actions are admirable, yet he also makes it clear that Tom never means to hurt another person. These two authors also relate to their readers in very different ways. In an earlier lecture, we were talking about the importance of this kind of relationship to our experience of the novel. In Pamela, we experience an intimate connection to Richardson's central character, largely because the story is told through her letters and diaries. To show you how this connection emerges, I'd like to explore a passage from the middle of the book. Here, Pamela considers what appears to be a simple question. Should she leave Mr. B now, He's just given her the chance to do so, or should she stick around for another couple of weeks to wait and see what happens? The answer to that question seems obvious. She should go. Mr. B is after her, after all. He's got designs on her virtue, and she knows that. She wants to remain pure. Yet in spite of all of those considerations, Pamela can imagine lots of reasons to stay, or at least to think about staying. And here's how she works through the many different sides of this dilemma. He went out, Mr. B went out, and I was tortured with 20 different thoughts in a minute. And here I think we need to look out for the rapidity, the quickness of Pamela's thinking. She's panicked, she's under a great deal of stress, and her thinking reflects that. Richardson wants us to see in this passage an image of how we think under pressure. He went out, and I was tortured with 20 different thoughts in a minute. Sometimes I thought that to stay a week or fortnight longer in this house to obey him, while Mrs. Jervis was with me, could do no great harm. But then, thinks I, how do I know what I may be able to do? I have withstood his anger, but may I not relent at his kindness? And that's an interesting question. You know, he's approached her in an angry mood, and she's been able to resist him. What if he starts to soften? What if he declares his love? What will she do then? She's not sure, and we see that uncertainty reflected in this passage. Well, I hope, thought I, by the same protecting grace in which I will always confide. But then, what has he promised? Why, he says he will make my poor mother and father's life comfortable. Oh, said I to myself, that is a rich thought, but let me not dwell upon it, for fear I should indulge it to my ruin. What can he do for me, poor girl as I am? So here she's sort of reckoning with the fact that he's offered to provide financially for her mother and father. They're not doing so well, and it would really be a help to them to get this money from Mr. B. She goes on to ask, though, even if he does this favor for my parents, what is he really willing, as a kind of aristocratic man, to do for me, a poor servant girl? What can he do for me, poor girl as I am? What can his greatness stoop to? What can he really do? How low can he go? He talks, thought I, of his pride of heart and pride of condition. Oh, these are in his head and in his heart too, or he would not confess them to me at such an instant. Well then, thought I, this can only be to seduce me. He has promised nothing. But I am to see what he will do if I stay a fortnight, and this fortnight, thought I again, is no such great matter, and I shall see in a few days how he carries it. So she decides to stay. Now, if you look at the text of this passage in your booklet, you'll see lots and lots of energetic punctuation. Question marks, exclamation points, lots of dashes. And clearly, Richardson is using those punctuation marks, that kind of writing, to create the image of a mind at work, weighing alternatives, imagining outcomes, reaching and then revising conclusions. And because there are so many passages of this sort in Pamela, we eventually become almost intimate with her. We get a really strong sense of how her mind works. In Tom Jones, we view the characters from a distance, eventually discovering that our most important relationship is not to Tom or to Sophie or to any of the novel's characters, but rather to the novel's worldly and learned narrator. Tom Jones is divided into 18 books, and each of those books begins with an essay from the narrator. Now, at first, these essays may appear inconsequential and even extraneous, and it was not uncommon for editors in the middle of the 20th century, publishers in the middle of the 20th century, to produce editions of Tom Jones in which these essays were either eliminated or severely cut down. The assumption being that our main concern should be with the characters. But as I've already tried to suggest, that assumption doesn't really work for Fielding, and it certainly doesn't work for Tom Jones. In that novel, Our primary interest is in the narrator. Our strongest relationship is to him. Now, more than the story, the essays present us with a kind of intellectual and ethical ideal, an image of humanity at its best. Okay. We're ready now to consider the endings of these novels. As we've noted in earlier lectures, the ending of a novel can be enormously significant and can send all kinds of signals about the social values that are being upheld or affirmed in the work as a whole. Both Pamela and Tom Jones end in marriage. They share that characteristic. But the authors do not endorse the same social values. That's an important point. In Richardson, with the promotion of Pamela up into the gentry, the emphasis is on social mobility and the eventual reconciliation of class conflicts. In Fielding, the stress falls very differently. As Tom Jones comes to a close, that novel seems to close ranks, as its wayward hero turns out to have been a gentleman all along. So, whereas Richardson marries a rich man to a poor girl, creating a new image of social harmony, Fielding marries a rich man to a rich girl, reinforcing existing class divisions. And I have to say that this is one feature of Fielding's work that often troubles and maybe even irritates some of my students. They like it better somehow when the hero moves up. They aren't entirely comfortable with the idea that he has somehow belonged at the top from the start. Now, the differences between these endings do not stop there, for each author seems to understand his ending in a different way. Richardson seems torn between providing a strong sense of closure and acknowledging the difficulty of the social issues he's attempting to surmount. The marriage of Pamela and Mr. B does not appear at the very end of the book, as we might expect. It appears maybe 2/3 of the way through, and it's followed by a number of scenes in which Pamela's new position is threatened not only by her husband. He becomes very dictatorial, very demanding, very controlling in these, last few pages. Her position is threatened not only by him, though, but also by his family and friends. His sister comes to visit him, and she insults Pamela in the most serious ways. Says that Pamela's a whore, says that the marriage is a fake, says that the marriage is a sham, completely unsettles their situation. And it's only by reading Pamela's letters and journals that Mr. B's sister is convinced of Pamela's worthiness. And it's very important for us to see that Pamela's writing is not just a means by which the story is conveyed to us, but a crucial part of the story, piece of the narrative puzzle. That's just the first installment of Pamela's story, though, because the novel was eventually followed by a sequel, usually known as Pamela in Her Exalted Condition, in which Mr. B hovers on the brink of an affair with a beautiful countess. And he doesn't go through with it. I think that we're all relieved to hear that. He doesn't go through with it. But he is tempted, pretty sorely tempted. And so we can say that although Richardson is eager to present his readers with a perfect comedic ending, the marriage of these two characters, the reconciliation of these two social classes, the reaffirmation of these traditional English mythologies and self-conceptions of communal shared values, shared living, he also seems to fear that such an ending would be unrealistic. He can't keep himself away from his own work, constantly adding, constantly revising, constantly destabilizing his own story. For his part, Fielding exhibits no such conflicts. His narrator assures us that Tom Jones and Sophie preserve the purest and tenderest affection for each other. Now, let me read the final passage from Tom Jones so you can get a sense of how we feel as we exit the world of that novel. To conclude, the narrator says, as there are not to be found a worthier man and woman than this fond couple, so neither can any be imagined more happy. And notice in that sentence the close connection between worthiness and happiness. Here again, the notion of poetic justice is very, very important to this novel. They preserve the purest and tenderest affection for each other, an affection daily increased and confirmed by mutual endearments and mutual esteem. Nor is their conduct toward their relations and friends less amiable than towards one another. And such is their condescension, their indulgence, and their beneficence to those below them, that there is not a neighbor, a tenant, or a servant who doth not most gratefully bless the day when Mr. Jones was married to his Sophia. Even more than Richardson, then, Fielding presents this marriage as a boon to society, and you can see that if you start to take the language of the passage apart. We start with the relationship between Tom and Sophie, the way they deal with each other. They preserve the purest and tenderest affection for each other. Then we expand the social circle. We look at their relations and friends, and we see that they bring the same consideration, the same sort of graciousness to those relationships. And then finally, we move down the social ladder. We look at their conduct towards those below them. And you'll notice that he moves here, sort of step by step, down that social ladder. There is not a neighbor. So here we're talking about other gentry families. There is not a neighbor, a tenant, a person who rents from you, a person who's economically dependent on you. But in some ways, a sort of social peer. You can socialize and get together and visit with your tenants sometimes. There is not a neighbor, tenant, or a servant. It goes in that order. Who doth not most gratefully bless the day when Mr. Jones was married to his Sophia. So, to say that class conflict is a central issue in the 18th century and a central issue in early English fiction is not to suggest that our writers offered any kind of unified response to it. Richardson's response is uncertain and conflicted, and that may have something to do with his own sort of difficult social position. He's not quite sure where he fits. He's not quite sure he wants to be a conservative, be a radical, be a reformer. And he has trouble sometimes managing the endings of his stories as a consequence. Fielding, on the other hand, is in many ways very conservative. Now, that's not to say that he isn't sometimes critical of social institutions and social values. He's very, very critical of them from time to time. It's just to say that he doesn't want to make any major changes or alterations to social structures. He is comfortable with the idea of a stratified society. He is comfortable with the idea that people end up at particular levels of society because they more or less deserve to be there. So, the narrative confidence, the literary confidence that we see in Fielding, though valuable, is not unrelated to a kind of social security that he feels, a social security that is not immediately available, not obviously available to someone like Richardson. In our next lecture, we're going to take up the legacy of Richardson and Fielding, concentrating on three writers from the second half of the 18th century. Now, as I've noted in an earlier lecture, the term novel and the notion of the novel as a new form, a new genre, is really only just emerging through the second half of the 18th century. The term is still being defined. It's still being employed in a variety of ways. And we'll see why that term remains unstable when we look at the work of three later writers. We're going to focus on Frances Burney, whose novels of female development were enormously important to Jane Austen. We're going to look at Lawrence Sterne, who was the inventor of the experimental novel tradition. There are many ways in which he takes some of the conventions established by authors like Richardson and Fielding and explodes them or begins to make fun of them. And we'll look at Anne Radcliffe, who's the most important of the Gothic novelists who emerge and become dominant in the later part of the 18th century. And I hope that in the process, we'll get a sense of how the novel tradition is taking shape, how the novel is continually defining and redefining itself, reinventing itself as the 18th century moves forward.